Hello guys, how are you all doing? This is Rob of Rule of Two Review. Welcome back to the channel, and man oh man, I am pretty sick. Luckily, I don't have COVID because that was my big fear last night as I started to feel something terrible coming on. I took my test today, doesn't seem to be COVID, so that's great. However, man, I am still pretty congested and feeling crummy. So, apologies in advance if I sound a little scratchy or stuffed up in this video. I hope it doesn't ruin the experience of watching it. But lucky for you, we're not here to talk about Rob feeling sick. We're actually here to talk about Metroid, the greatest video game topic one could possibly enjoy. And as you guys know, my favorite video game topic. And what I'm focusing on today is the possible future of 2D Metroid, and more specifically, the future of 2D Metroid remakes, because this has been a topic of conversation for a long time. There's even been stories and information and possible rumors leading towards Mercury Steam being in the process of making a new 2D Metroid game, some of which theorize could be another remake. And I find it all very fascinating and interesting. I obviously have very strong opinions on the concept of 2D Metroid remakes based on the two that already exist. We can't forget there are two existing Metroid 2D game remakes, and I have strong opinions on the ones that already exist and what I think could happen in the future, what I think should or should not happen, and all of that fun stuff. And so I want to break it down and give my own spin on where I think they should go. So first and foremost, let's address the two existing 2D Metroid remake games. And the first happens to be possibly my favorite of all 2D Metroid experiences, and I know this is very controversial because most people would not agree, but we're talking about Metroid Zero Mission, released on the Game Boy Advance in 2004, which is a full-on remake of the original 1986 NES Metroid game, the first Metroid game, which I feel very fortunate enough to be able to say that I am old enough that I was actually playing the original Metroid game when it was a new current game in the mid-80s on the NES. Because yes, I am that old of an old man, and I did start with the Metroid franchise at the very beginning, and I loved it. So when the Game Boy Advance was the current Nintendo handheld on the market, I actually was working for GameStop at the time, back in the early 2000s, and Metroid Zero Mission released, and it was this crazy idea of remaking that game. And you have to remember, this is at a time when the concept of remaking existing old games was very new, and I don't even know how many other remakes of old games existed at the time. I don't know if this is the first, but it's definitely one of the very first. And they did an incredible job taking the skeleton of that game, the NES game, and, you know, giving it basically a Super Metroid inspired visual 16-bit makeover, and moving things around and even adding some additional content at the end of the game where you actually play as Samus in her Zero suit, which added into not only the Zero Mission aspect of basically being the first mission she ever goes on, but also the fact that she wears the Zero suit in an additional mode or section of the game. There was a lot more Chozo imagery and lore thrown into the game that obviously did not exist back when the original came out on the NES. And it's a short game, and it's an easy game. And I know most people will say Super Metroid is their favorite 2D Metroid game, or maybe even Metroid Dread. A lot of new fans feel like Dread is the best 2D Metroid game. Both of those games are mind-blowing, but I don't know, man. Maybe it's my nostalgia, or maybe it's just my preferences, but I love Zero Mission, and it is my favorite 2D Metroid game, and it is the first 2D Metroid remake. Now, of course, the second 2D Metroid remake, as we all know, would be Metroid Samus Returns, released on the 3DS in 2017. Way back in 2017, when Metroid Prime 4 was announced, if you guys remember. That was the year of Double Metroid. It was a fantastic time. Obviously, Metroid Prime 4, that's its own mystery and mess, and we're not going to get into that. But 6 years ago in 2017 is when Samus Returns released. And that was an incredible 3D polygonal visual style that's still on a 2D gameplay plane remake of Metroid 2, The Return of Samus, which was an original Game Boy game. So between these two games, they've remade the original NES game, and they've remade Metroid 2, Samus Returns being that game. And I've gone on record many times saying that I think Samus Returns is also a wonderful game. I mean, to me, that game is like a 9 out of 10 almost. It definitely hovers somewhere around that score in my brain. And as we all know, that was Mercury Steam's first crack at a Metroid game, and it also laid the foundational template for what would become Metroid Dread, which we all know, of course, is Metroid 5. The general visual style and tone and approach and the gameplay with the counters and the sliding and a lot of what was going on in Metroid Dread actually first was introduced with Samus Returns on the 3DS. And so I think that game is wonderful. I am absolutely in the camp of thinking that Samus Returns deserves a 3D port to the Nintendo Switch the exact same way they're doing with Luigi's Mansion Dark Moon. They should do the same with Samus Returns. It's a wonderful game that a lot of people missed because it released at the very end of the 3DS's life, and I think it would do wonderful if they were to repackage and resell it on the Nintendo Switch with better graphics. I mean, I think it's 1 million sales easy, just based on Metroid Prime Remastered alone. So those are the two existing 2D Metroid remakes, which of course catches us up to right now, where I'm now theorizing and postulating on what could happen with the future of Metroid remakes. And like I said at the beginning of the video, there are people who think that that could be something that's happening. Earlier this year, there was a discussion about somebody who lives in Spain and is familiar with or close to Mercury Steam, who is a Spanish developer, by the way, again, responsible for Samus Returns and Metroid Dread, discussing that they are working on some kind of new 2D Metroid game. Now, that's not confirmed, but that's a story from somebody who's been correct about Metroid stuff in the past when it comes to Mercury Steam, and so the jury is still out on what is actually happening, but I think we all believe there is a great chance Mercury Steam has been handed the reins of some kind of new 2D Metroid experience. Now, that could be Metroid 6, it could be a different new Metroid game that wouldn't be called Metroid 6, or, the purpose of this video, it could be another remake of a Metroid game. And I think that the first game everyone thinks about is Super Metroid. As I'd already pointed out in this video, both Metroid 1 and Metroid 2 have been remade. Mercury Steam was responsible for one of those remakes. In theory, if Nintendo liked what was going on there and wanted to continue remaking old classic 2D Metroid games, well, naturally, you'd move on to the next game in line, which would be Super Metroid, because that is Metroid 3. Now, do I think this is something that will happen? I'm about 50-50. I could see Nintendo deciding to do that, and honestly, maybe that percentage has gone up a little bit, you know, seeing that they've been willing to remake games like Super Mario RPG and Paper Mario Thousand Year Door, all recent reveals and games coming out very soon. If they're willing to go into the obscure realm of remaking games like that in Mario, why wouldn't they then continue one of their most famous games, Super Metroid? It's not an obscure game like a Paper Mario or a Mario RPG might be for that franchise. It's a main game, it's a beloved game, it's been legendary for, you know, ever since it was released, 30 years ago. It's an incredible game. And I think that given the success they've seen with Mercury Steam as the developer, why not move on to Super Metroid? I'm mixed on whether or not I want it, because part of me feels like I'd rather the next 2D Metroid game just be a new game and not a remake of Super Metroid. That being said, if we were to see a remake of Super Metroid and something done that looked and played even better than Metroid Dread does, oh my god, I just start licking my chops. It would be incredible, it would sell well, people would love it, the hype would be out of this world. And so yeah, maybe there's a chance Mercury Steam or even some other developer is working on a Super Metroid remake, because in a lot of ways it makes sense. Now, of course, that turns us to the last potential option, and another game that fans have discussed as desiring as far as 2D Metroid remakes, which would be Metroid Fusion, of course, also Game Boy Advance game. That's Metroid 4. That released in 2002 on the Game Boy Advance. Another great, phenomenal game. All these 2D Metroid games are great, if you can't tell. I'm a big fan of them. And so, even though there's been a lot of desires and rumors out there about a Super Metroid remake, I myself, as somebody who makes a ton of Metroid content on YouTube, have heard from people many times over the years about wanting a Metroid Fusion remake. And I find that to be an interesting case, because you have to consider, if, let's say it's Mercury Steam, let's just kind of stick with that for the sake of conversation. If Mercury Steam is working on a Metroid remake and not a new 2D Metroid game, it would be very strange for them to skip Super Metroid and go to Metroid Fusion. To me, that just doesn't make sense. Now, Metroid Fusion has a lot more relation to Metroid Dread, the recently released game, and so maybe Nintendo would see a benefit to doing that because it just feels more current with the timeline and the stories being told. But I don't know. I just feel like it doesn't make sense. If they were willing to remake Metroids 1 and 2, why would you skip Metroid 3 and then go right to Metroid 4, right? So nothing is impossible, but it just doesn't make a lot of sense. However, if I close my eyes and I envision a Metroid Fusion remake as opposed to a Super Metroid remake, in a weird way, I almost get more excited. Because I think because I think Super Metroid just doesn't need to be touched or changed, even though I would welcome it. And B, because there's a little bit more of a unique hook and a gimmick to Metroid Fusion. It's a lot more narrative focused. It introduced the idea of Adam Malkovich to Samus and her relationship with him, and I know people groan because they don't like Metroid Other M, but we have to give Metroid Fusion credit because that's where this started. Again, very narrative focused. You have the SAX as kind of this horror-inspired entity that's chasing Samus. You have the fact that she's wearing the fusion suit, which allows her to merge with the X-Parasite throughout the game, and so I think that modernizing Metroid Fusion, I think, presents a lot more opportunity for just a more interesting remake than Super Metroid, which is just a straightforward but very excellent Metroid experience. And so this is all a long way for me to say that when you think about it, the 2D Metroid remake situation, there are only 2 games available, right? I spent time discussing the existing ones, Zero Mission and Samus Returns, but outside of that, the only other 2 options really are Super Metroid and Metroid Fusion. Because outside of those, you've got the other remakes and you've got Metroid Dread. You know, I mean, that's all that really exists. So, whether it's Mercury Steam, whether it's somebody else, if there are Metroid remakes being developed, it would be one of those 2 games, Super Metroid or Metroid Fusion. I don't know that I believe that this is the current choice or path for 2D Metroid. I really want to believe and even hope that Nintendo's next 2D Metroid plans are actually a new game. And Sakamoto was talking about this himself when Metroid Dread was coming out, how as long as there's a desire for Samus, there's going to be plans for future Metroid games. Even though Metroid Dread represented, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says even though Metroid Dread represented the end of the conflict between Samus and the Metroids, there are future stories we have to tell. And so he planted the seed for a new game, not a remake of a Metroid game. So it's all very interesting. I guess I wouldn't say confusing. It's just very mysterious. You know, what are they going to do? And what do the fans want? You know, you've kind of heard what I want. I'm a Metroid fan who always will prefer a new Metroid experience as opposed to a remade version of an old one. But that doesn't mean that I wouldn't like another remake of an old game, right? A Samus Returns HD port, that's an easy gimme. That should happen no matter what. Remaking Super Metroid, remaking Fusion, very exciting prospects, but I wouldn't want that to happen in lieu of a new Metroid game. In a perfect world, they could maybe do both. So, like I said, there were rumors around a year ago about this, but there's nothing concrete. This isn't really about rumors. This is just about me as a Metroid fan speculating and discussing what makes sense and what options are on the table. It's an exciting prospect. Who knows what the future will reveal, but I do think whatever the plans for 2D Metroid are going to probably be revealed to us either next year or the year after in 2025. So it's an exciting time. We will wait to see what happens, and that's about it.